Doesn't need a man to introduce him.
Thank you. So it's Marina Prentoulis. I'm a member of Syriza. I think I have an affiliation to the academic one, but the Syriza one. But I'm also here I've been here for 20 years, and I'm a member of the Labour Party as well, and of Greece Solidarity Campaign. And I know some of you've been involved in Greece Solidarity Campaign as well. So I try to focus a little bit on Greece. I'm also campaigning with Another Europe, by the way, but I will try not to get in the issues of the campaigning and focus a little bit on Greece. So in terms of Greece, austerity and the situation that Greece found itself in, it started for us in 2010. When the crisis started, I cannot move. Can I move?
Yes.
Of course.
Yes?
Yes.
Are you sure?
Not too far.
Okay.
Don't
Move to the
left.
So for us, the crisis started in 2010 when the then Prime Minister George Papandreou announced that we will be subjected to the lending mechanisms of Troika, and with Troika we mean the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission. Before that, and although the financial crisis had started, most of the people in Greece thought that it will not have a big effect on Greece, the people in the street, I mean. And the reason for that is that they were saying, okay, we don't have a big financial sector, probably we don't have a big problem. So George Papandreou announces that we will be subjected to the memoranda, these lending agreements, and the logic behind the lending agreements is that if you move towards cuts, austerity, structural reforms, and so on, we will be able to service the Greek debt. The Greek debt, within 5 years, however, since we were subjected to the lending mechanisms, it grew to 108% of the GDP. So it wasn't working, it wasn't going very well. The first reaction to this situation was through the indignant movements. A lot of people in the main squares across different towns of Greece. And the situation, and why there was this reaction, it was very devastating because, first of all, there were cuts, and when we are talking there about cuts, is something like 40% of pensions and wages being cut. We are talking about unemployment, 36%, probably 60% among young people. There are unofficial figures that they say that there were probably 10,000 people who committed suicide because of austerity, losing their jobs, financial issues, and so on. And some of these, one at least case, it was an older gentleman, around 75, who committed with a gun in the central square of Athens. And he left a note and he said, look, I've been working all my life to have a pension. I cannot get to the point where I will be looking at the garbage for food. I cannot do that. So it was a huge crisis in the Greek society. It was very visible. A lot of people were suffering. Of course, the lower strata, but also the middle strata as well, which they lost quite a lot of their power as well. So the whole of society started to disintegrate. And the response was people taking over the squares, the main square in Athens, but this was happening across every city in Greece in 2011. This is the indignant movement. It followed from the Spanish one. And we have to remember there, and this I think is relevant for the referendum as well, that the people who went in these movements to protest, and we are talking about probably millions of people coming from the squares, some were staying there for days, some they were just going, being part of debates, living and so on. But the diversity of the demands was huge. So you could have people that were against the political system, and most of the people, they were against the political establishment, which is mainly the Conservative Party, New Democracy, and PASOK, which is the socialist party, which started to collapse at that point. But a lot of people were going with much more humane demands. So a lot of parents, for example, they were afraid of the future of their children and what is going to happen. But also you had very conservative right-wing people that they were going there with the idea that, look, we cannot take all these immigrants that we see around. They're responsible for the austerity. All this diversity of demands were part of the squares. In Athens, it was a little bit divided on the higher part of the square, where it's the parliament. People were effectively shouting against the political establishment, and then you could have even fascists involved as well. But on the lower part of the square, it was where people trying to find different ways of doing things, how we can have a real democracy or direct democracy, and they were, like the Spanish did, organizing assemblies and having people talking to each other and trying to think a different way of organizing society. This lasted about 3 or 4 months. This then died out. I mean, not just like that. The riot police tried and evacuated the squares. And then a lot of these people got involved in networks which they had their bases in many cases on neighborhoods, and they were providing what the state couldn't anymore provide at that point: social clinics, food kitchens, wholesale markets. But in all these initiatives, they were seeing themselves as being quite political. It wasn't about charity or philanthropy. It was, let's get engaged, let's bring people in. We are the ones that we are going to take care of the situation, and together we will fight against austerity and we will manage the crisis. So it had this political, it was a political initiative as well. Of course, this was not done by political parties, although a lot of the people that were involved, they were part of political parties, and a lot of the people were involved by Syriza as well. But if there was a party affiliation in a solidarity network, people would join. You wanted something that people would feel comfortable, that it's not about party politics, you are not there to sell them one policy or the other, so people can go in and get engaged. And this is at the same time when Syriza started to gain electoral power progressively, and after the squares, and in January 2015 it was elected in the government. Syriza is an interesting case in terms of politics. Of course, to have a left government elected, I don't think people should understand from that people turned left-wing from one day to the next. This is not how it works. Not half of Greek society is left in the traditional sense. What changed is that the political affiliations that people were holding up to that point, because of the crisis, they were loosened. People were trying to find a new way. And Syriza was a party that it wasn't talking about all the working classes or the revolution and so on. It had a much broader perspective, what I call left-wing populism, trying to create a people broader and different groups and different demands coming together in that, and it was bringing these people against the political establishment, the lack of democracy, neoliberalism, and so on. But it is a different type of party than what people assume sometimes. In itself, it was a coalition of many different parties, but the main left-wing parties. But the main strand within there, it was Synaspismos, which is where Tsipras comes from. I wasn't coming from that party, I'm coming from another one, more on the left of Tsipras. And it had a more, although this, we may not understand the same thing when I use this label, a more Euro-communist ideological reservoir, let's say. So, Syriza comes to power. Immediately, the European establishment, obviously the Greek establishment as well, they start talking about what a huge disaster is going to be. From people, friends in Brussels, I know that from the beginning, they didn't want Syriza, any left government, to be in power. And the negotiations regarding the lending agreement start. First there was an interim agreement, but then we have probably the negotiations that you watched on the news, which took until July 2015. They started in February and they lasted through July 15. And the negotiations were quite revealing, and I think they were quite revealing for all Europeans as well. Because you had a country, a small country, that it was suffering, that it wanted to try to find a solution against austerity. And on the other hand, you had institutions, and we have to remember, of course, that Greece is part of the Eurozone as well, which is not the case with Britain. Institutions that they were totally unsympathetic to the proposals of the Greek government, and they were trying to put it down any way they could. But I think it was the first time that this became so visible, and it was everywhere in the mainstream media, and people could watch that. So from the beginning they were against the left-wing government, and of course they used a lot of narratives that they were trying to stereotype the situation in Greece, and narratives that they showed how neoliberalism works in terms of trying to promote its own economics. So there was this frame. I was doing the media of series at that point, and they were saying to me, but look, this is the journalist. But look, if you consume a lot and you are in debt, as Greece is, we all know that you will have to cut your expenses. It is as if you took too much money on your credit card. So it's the household economics logic, which is easily accessible to a lot of people, and this was the frame that it was used by mainstream media. Most economists know that macroeconomics, they have nothing to do with this logic. This is not how things work. But it was an accessible frame to use in order to persuade people, to explain to people why Greece had to pay and why what was going on, it was justifiable. There were other frames that they were using against Greece as well. So, for example, one of them was that Greece has certain pathologies. It's the Greek people, an essentialist logic, that Greek people are all lazy and they are all taking too long holidays and they operate in different ways. Stereotyping, using ethnicity there, in order to avoid discussing much bigger problems, structural problems that exist within the Eurozone and problems that we see now in the EU as well. But in my view, what we saw at that point, it was that the institutions, the European institutions, they are, in a similar way like national institutions are, have accepted this postmodern democratic condition. That means it's experts, and the experts that they were bringing in the negotiations in the case of Greece, that they are the ones that they have the first say. The idea of the people, or the voice of the people, or the democratic mandate of the people, people being involved in that, has been excluded. This is not only for the institutions of the EU, this is what is happening on national level as well. We have all these people that they know better, and we are not very stupid, and we should vote occasionally, but that's it. We shouldn't be more involved in matters that we don't understand. So I think this is what, through the negotiations, they were trying to promote, this bureaucratic technocracy that we don't understand the EU, but they know better. And behind that, what they were hiding is an attempt to promote neoliberal policies as much as possible. And there is a quote in relation to that from Schäuble, and Schäuble said, Athens can vote as many times as it likes, but that doesn't mean rules allow it. Go on voting forever, we don't care. That's it. And these rules that he was referring to, as a lot of people had said at that point, it was an interpretation of the rules that existed. Or he was inventing rules. But the idea behind that was that we have the rules, we hold the expertise, democracy doesn't matter. What the people want to say doesn't matter anymore. And this was, of course, with the key moment in the negotiations, the referendum of July 5th, because the Greek government called the referendum. They thought, I think, at that point that this will strengthen their negotiating power. And what happened is that it totally infuriated the European institutions. And you want to say why? Come on, I mean, people can vote. So people voted. It was amazing that despite the pressure on Greece, 62% of the people voted rejecting austerity. It infuriated the EU, and of course, from there on, they became even harsher, and at the end, they imposed another lending agreement on Greece, a catastrophic agreement, imposing more austerity, demanding structural reforms, privatizations as we speak are going ahead, and so on. Some people say, why did Greece or the Greek government accept that? Why didn't they leave the EU? I think sometimes they, especially when I hear that in Britain, it pisses me off, because it shows very little understanding of what are the conditions in other countries as well. Greece is in the Balkans, it's not an island like Britain. It has enemies around them, one of which is Erdogan as well. It has disputes with Turkey, and the whole area of the Balkans is very unstable. It wouldn't have the same effect. Not every country living it will have the same effect, or it will face the same problems after that. It also pisses me off because a lot of people are saying, yeah, then you have the drachma, it's totally devalued, but then people will come and invest. So the idea there was that we should be turned into Malaysia, where we are shouting for having very low wages and people being paid $1 a week in order to become more competitive and attract more investment that it wants low labor laws and no employment rights. Why did Syriza stay then? I think because we do believe, and I do believe that very strongly, that things are going to change if we start fighting against neoliberalism united. Neoliberalism has been willing. I mean, Britain has been a great exporter of neoliberalism in Europe. The worst treaties that they are passing is because Britain is supporting them and pushing for them. But neoliberalism, since Thatcherism, it has been building its power for 30 years. They are winning elections, they are occupying institutions, they are pushing European institutions towards a particular direction. And we haven't done that. We haven't been winning the same elections, we haven't been creating the same alliances, we don't have the same power. But that doesn't mean that this is not the way that we could change the situation in the EU. And I believe this should work on different levels. First, you need, I think, a very strong grassroots movement. I believe the same for national politics as well. It's not only voting for a government, it's bringing the people out that they can support this government when it will want to push for changes that they will be not very attractive to big businesses. I believe the same for Britain as well. Restrictions on their activity, so you need a grassroots movement. I believe the same on European level as well. Some of you are members of the Greek Solidarity campaign as well. And then, when this situation was going on in Greece, the amount of people that we could mobilize in Britain in support from Greece, it was 5,000, maybe 10,000 people that they will actively go in the streets and talk about what is happening in Greece and demonstrate with us. This shows that we are not at a point where we have created this European identity and we have this understanding that what is happening to me, it is connected with what is happening to the next country, and neoliberalism will be attacking different countries in different moments. The same, I believe, for example, in relation to the movement in France now. The law that they are trying to pass in France, it was passed in Greece in 2011, and I think it has been passed, I'm not totally sure, I haven't checked that, maybe you know, many years ago in Britain. But we never felt this connection between us, that they are going transnationally to attack labor rights. And I think this is something that we have to work for. But the same goes for the European institutions as well. If you put all progressive institutions together, they cannot take over the other side. And one of the interesting things that happened with the Greek negotiations is we saw that social democratic parties started, within the EU, started to divide. And the French had a fight with the German Social Democratic Party. And some of the social democratic parties have internalized too much of the opposite ideology. And this has to change. And there is something there which says we have to reclaim our parties as well. And we have to put people in place that they are going to go to support labor rights. At the same time, I think that we should not stay in the old type of party blocks that we have within the European institutions as well. We need to create bigger alliances across the progressive forces within the EU, and we start to have start challenging the power of the other side, and we are not there yet. So for me, we have to stay in the EU, and we have to try and transform. So this, I think, is what the Greek government had decided. People can say that, oh, yeah, but this was not correct. It's easy to say to other people that. Although sometimes we have to understand, I think, better the context in which we are talking. But I think the plan generally, if we want to take over international capital or neoliberalism that it operates transnationally, is to create a different balance of forces within the EU institutions. And I think because of the case, this has already started. Thank you.
Just the chair.
No, the chair.
Yeah, just one question.
Are you coming back?
Coming back, just do any questions.
Are we taking discussion now, or
Yes.
okay? So, thank you very much, Marina. So, Russell.
You're going to take questions.
Yes.
Taking questions.
Questions?
Right. Marina, thank you for a very illuminating account of the situation in Syriza. I've heard you speak many times before, and what I'm going to say is probably going to piss you off.
Ah, great. It happens to me all the time. I'm a Greek
Even
after.
further. What I am going to say is, if it was just myself as an outside observer being critical of Syriza, I would perhaps construe that as arrogance. But what I'm saying is also based on what many Greeks think and believe, and it's based on the actions of what I've observed by many Greeks. Foremost among that is the fact that the left wing of Syriza split and went its own way and formed its own political grouping called Popular Unity.
3 different ones.
Okay, or 3 different ones. But so what I want to actually say is I feel that the left in Europe invested a tremendous amount of hope in Syriza. And I also think that that hope crystallized in a veritable act of political defiance when Syriza called the referendum. And the fact that it could effectively repudiate that almost so blithely seems to me to be an incredible betrayal, and I think it's a massive setback not just for the politically conscious left wing, but it's a massive setback in being able to mobilize people across Europe, because the example of Greece can always be invoked. You voted for these mavericks, these renegades, and we always said that they would lead you to disaster. So I think my position remains one of Lexit, not Brexit, Lexit, because I think the EU is an intrinsically corrupting influence by virtue of the power that it holds over European institutions, which I actually think, in terms of the example of Greece, means that the EU, as it's constituted, is unreformable.
Thank you, Russell. Can I just say, we have the debate on the referendum itself. Maybe
Can I respond?
No,
We focus on Greek cases.
One second. I'll make a point. Of course you can respond. 1 second. So just say, we have session 3 about abstaining, remaining. Let's try and, let's talk about Greece at the moment and talk about the referendum positions maybe a bit later. Otherwise, we won't have a session 3 to have.
I did mainly confine myself to Greece.
Okay, all right. Do you want to respond? I will take one more point, and then you can respond. One more, and then you respond. Okay. Yeah, carry on. Then
Marina's comments on Schäuble, and you can vote as often as you like, but we're not going to take any notice of you. I think that's very striking, and there's a problem, I think, by moving on a year and saying your concluding point that the balance of forces is beginning to change inside the European institutions, when the imposition of an even harder deal on Greece after the referendum in Greece demonstrated something that has been at the core of thinking about the EU at the elite level. When what were the German ordo-liberals, what we think of as neoliberals today, but slightly different, because the neoliberals just think markets are self-correcting and work. The ordo-liberals think markets have to be made, but the commonality is the mob should not be allowed to influence this. And the chief negotiator of the German state, West German state, at the time of the construction of the European EEC, in Messina, before the Rome Treaty, was an ordo-liberal who'd been a Nazi in the 30s and a Christian Democrat in the post-war period. And he came up with plans to keep the mob out, you concentrate decision-making in the Commission. The French rejected each of his proposals, thinking that they were looking at them in detail. Eventually he said, well, you come up with proposals. They did, and he ticked them, they said, you haven't read them. He said, I don't need to read them. As long as there's no democracy, we can work out the details another time. So in fact, the Greek referendum, if there had been a better deal for Greece after the referendum, that would have ripped up the European Union's defining logic. In fact, contrary to what we would do if somebody opposed us, you'd accommodate. But they had to be even harder to prove that the mob couldn't influence the EU. Just what your comments are.
Do you want to respond now? Or
Let me reply to this too.
Reply to these two, and then you do, okay? Please, Marina.
In terms of, first of all, because we are discussing the referendum as well, the referendum was not in relation to EU membership, it was rejecting austerity. Yeah? In terms of, sorry? Yeah.
No, the one in Greece, the Greek, yeah.
The Greek one.
Yeah,
so because in Greece as well, they see the referendum as being the equivalent of what was happening in Greece, and you say no, this is not how things are working. And yes, there was the left split in Syriza. What is quite interesting in that respect is that there were 3 parties. So the left that split, it cannot even form its own coalition outside Syriza as well. But also how low their percentage of the vote is and was at the second election, because after September 2015, after January, there was a second election and Syriza was re-elected again. And there is something there, the Greek people, for different reasons, there are different narratives there, they were seeing themselves as being part of the EU. They wouldn't, at least at that point, they were massively in favor of staying within the EU. 75%, I think it was, despite of what was happening. there are other narratives there. So the referendum wasn't about the EU. Greek people thought, the government thought that it will support their negotiating position, but something else happened at that point as well. They thought that it will support their negotiating position because we thought that the idea is that we want to keep the European Union and the Eurozone united. And Schäuble again said, no, this is not necessarily the case. And this is what it came as very striking thing for a lot of different people. So he said, no, you could go out if you want for a particular period of time, with conditions, of course, that they will totally enslave Greece and you wouldn't have any voice within the institutions as well. But where we were assuming that it is about keeping everything together so you have a negotiating card, we saw suddenly that there is another plan from Schäuble that says, no, let's create a core, Germany and other countries, and leave the others periphery. This periphery to me sounds like neocolonization in a certain way. And I think this is what shocked other forces within the EU as well. So I don't think that the balance of powers has changed, as you suggested, but I think something is happening. So I think it's the first time that parties that they are not necessarily in the same bloc, like Labour Party or Syriza, they start to have some type of communication as well. Other things happen. There was the division between the institutions. So the moment the negotiation and the deal is signed, the IMF comes out and says, yeah, but their debt is unsustainable. While all this time they were they were operating together. So again, there as well, you have a break, which you could politically use it. Syriza is using it by saying, we don't want the IMF anymore being part of the Greek story, and Germany insisting that it should. But there are other, it is quite a complicated story, because for us there was a second crisis, which is the refugee crisis. And while you are trying to form alliances within the EU, on the issue of the refugee crisis, these frontiers shift again. And then you have Germany coming out as the good person saying, no, we are not against the refugees. And you have already another organized bloc, led by Austria, which says, no, we are going to close our borders. So there is a certain complexity in the EU, and it is very difficult to create a clear frontier and fight with that. It seems that it is always shifting, and the enemy is internal rather than external, so it makes everything more complicated. But I think the main forces, as the EU stands right now, are conservative forces, are against the refugees, are countries that they are closing their borders, and countries that they want to go back to the nation state. And you cannot go back to the nation state. We have moved from that. We have to find forms of unity rather than division. You cannot have any change or any, I mean, people in Britain were saying, oh, but we show solidarity about the refugees. How? By having 5,000 people in Trafalgar Square? That's not enough. I want you in, and I want you to pressurize, with a different government, obviously, to pressurize on this issue so the EU accepts the quota and so on in different countries. I think it's a matter of thinking where we can make a difference, a political difference, how we can intervene politically. I'm not trying to say that the situation is good, but I think, and this goes also in terms of the decision of the left wing and the Lexit as well, in Britain, I mean, that you have to think.
We need the Lexit thing till the last bit, okay.
But for us it is this, it's a political decision that you make, okay, where can potentially bring some change.
Okay, thank you. I'm just trying to put some lights on here, Russell. It's a very, where are the light switches?
I was going to do that after Marina. I was going to put on the lights. Although some people might object to unnatural light.
No, eventually you won't be able to see each other here. So Steve,
Yeah, obviously it's difficult, all these things are connected, so it's difficult to try to avoid moving from one to the other, but I do try to do that. I think obviously there's one set of arguments that socialists might have about Syriza itself and the problems it had as a party, you know, as a socialist party. So that's one argument one can have. But I think, I'm not going to go into that route, what I'm interested in, I think that what we have, there's just two conclusions, I think, two opposite conclusions you can draw from this experience. One conclusion might be that the thing's busted and we should withdraw from it. That's one set of conclusions that people will make. And there's another conclusion, I think, also, that perhaps the power structure is such that you can't fight it from within a single country. You know, that basically what happened was that Greece took it about as far as it could possibly go, especially because of that referendum, which showed clearly to everybody where the Greek people stood. So that was a public statement, you know, a European-wide statement, what the Greek people didn't want that. But they got it anyway. And so my conclusion might be, actually you can't deal with it. You can't deal with this supranational body from within a small country. You know, so that's not to say that Syriza didn't make mistakes or they couldn't have done something else. Okay, I'm not saying that, but I don't want to go into that particular thing. I think there is two ways out of it.
Okay, sorry, just as other people want to speak. Come back to you. Marina, you want to say something?
Yeah, my problem with Marina's outlook is that I think it's based on a reading of the situation generally, that this enormous power of what she calls the conservative forces that she believes are the main forces that are dominating. I don't agree with that. I think what we have is very dangerous and right-wing tendencies in many countries, and in some countries like Hungary, they run the government almost on a fascist basis, Austria, and so on. But that if we just look at that side of it, we're not actually seeing the movements that brought these onto the surface. The movement that brought them onto the surface is the economic and political crisis of all these countries, including Britain. And that is thrown up all these things. And in fact, right next to Greece, you have Macedonia, which at this very moment, there's, I believe, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets demanding the ousting of their regime, which is for corruption, you know, which is virtually in Greece, Macedonia, I mean, part of it is in Greece. You know, there is this conflict going on in all these countries, particularly also we saw the occupation of the central part of Istanbul for months and months against the regime there. So it is an ongoing struggle. And I think the only way that possibly, you know, for Syriza to got out of that terrible situation that was imposed on it would have been to appeal to all the workers in the Balkan states around it, workers in the rest of Europe, not just workers but middle class people, young people who were extremely anxious and sympathetic to this plight of a small country being bulldozed into this terrible debt slavery, and which is also true of Ireland as well. So I think that you know, it requires a vision beyond the existing institutions, which I think that there's an overestimation of what is called neoliberalism, which even the neoliberals don't even think is an ideology, it's a really cohesive ideology. Neoliberalism is tearing itself to pieces everywhere, in particular in its heartland, which is like Britain. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 8 minutes left in this session, so anybody hasn't spoken? Yeah, Karen. Okay, I didn't see you there.
Yeah. Hi, Marina. My name is Joseph Healy. I'm one of the principal speakers of Left Unity. Technically, we're your sister party. I went 3 years ago to Athens with a delegation from Greece Solidarity, and it was mainly around the medical system, health system, and I have to say I was utterly shocked by what we saw there. And I said to people when I came back, you cannot describe the horror of the situation until you've actually seen it. And you know, no journalist account can really describe it sufficiently. So I'm very aware of how bad the situation is. It's probably got worse since. So I think, Greek people found themselves in a very, very difficult situation. But I had the experience less than a month ago going to Denmark, being sent as a delegate to the Red-Green Alliance, the other party in Denmark. And I found myself there like as a Cassandra almost at the feast, because 450 delegates voted unanimously for Denmark to leave the European Union. And they did have a British speaker there from the RMT who presented a case about the left here being utterly in favour of Brexit and so on and so forth. But speaker after speaker, there was not a single speech in Denmark, not a single speaker supporting the EU. And one of the, two of the issues that arose during that discussion was the situation in Ireland, which you referred to with the referenda, and the situation in Greece. So, the ripples from Greece have really spread across Europe and have impacted very much on the left. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about was the spectre of fascism, because Varoufakis has been, going around quite rightly, I think, warning about the dangers of fascism across Europe. And at one of the workshops there on the EU, I raised this issue, and I had a young Danish woman saying, if we're in a loveless marriage, we should leave. Why should we be afraid of the big black dog of fascism? So they discounted that as an issue. But one of the chilling memories I have of the Greek election was a member of Golden Dawn being interviewed outside one of the polling stations and saying, well, we'll give them a year, and after that it's our turn. So I'd like to ask what you think about that aspect of the whole thing.
Just one more speaker, then you respond, and then we're finished. Yeah.
Yeah, John Bridge. Yeah, it does seem to me that if we counterpose things on the basis of, on the one side, there's the nation state, and we can reform that and we can do very well. I personally think that's delusional, so I agree with you there. On the other hand, I actually think that the idea of there's the EU, it's not very friendly at the moment, it's not very democratic. Let's transform it into a nice cuddly capitalist institution, or a nice institution that socialists can use. I think that's also delusional. Of course I agree with the comrades who've spoken about international coordination and all the rest of it. But just 2 points. One, you say that Syriza was elected. That's absolutely true, of course. You had a majority in Parliament, but don't you have a 40 MP top-up for the biggest party?
What do you mean?
The largest
the
party
electoral system.
gets 40 MPs
50.
free, right? They don't get elected. In other words, if you actually take Syriza, in my view, it should have said its first act is to get rid of this farce of democracy. I mean, if that meant not coming to power, or not taking office, I should say, to me that would be preferable compared with where you are now, because to me what you turn, I'm not saying you, I shouldn't be saying it personally, but what your comrades have turned themselves into, to me, from where I look at it, sorry, is agents of austerity that Joseph has just described. And the fact that the voters stood up has amazed me, but you know more about Greece than I do, so I'm very surprised that the vote stood up. I thought you become agents of austerity, and the normal thing happens to left social democrat parties. Your base goes, well, you're no different to the rest. So my take would have been, and was at the time, don't take office, because you're going to be doing things that you would hate to do, which is what you've done.
Don't worry, that's coming.
Well, okay, I don't know.
We have one meeting here. Thank you very much. Marina, do you want to respond?
I'll start from the last.
Okay.
And there were a lot of people in Syriza which they were thinking that, don't think that everybody was, let's go and take power. So you have again to think, what are we going to do? One possible path forward is to say, I'll stay in power and I will try to manage or try to do something, although I will be imposing austerity, which is what is happening, or the other to say, no, we shouldn't do that because this will be bad for the left and not take power. So there is this dilemma there. I think what I believe personally is that if you can stop it a little bit or make it less hard on the lower strata, you should go in. It's a difficult, it's not that I don't have also my question marks about that, but I'm thinking it's a difficult one, let's put it, but I recognize what you say. In terms of parliamentary, because that's what I thought you meant, the electoral system, it's, in Greece, contrary to Britain, it's a mixed one. You are not even close to having anything as democratic as that. So it is proportional representation, but in order for the first and the second party to have some instance, you get the extra seats. Equally, I could say we need to change proportional representation across many countries, Britain as well, and make it. But I think there is a serious discussion about that right now in Parliament. I don't know if it's going to go through. In terms, however, of what we are discussing, one of the things that I hate very much on the left is this idea of thinking only in terms of heroes and traitors. So in the one case, you have, oh, Syriza is going to win over capitalism in the good days, heroes everywhere. They are crushed, then it's total traitors. And I don't think it's politics, it's about that. It is about understanding that, yeah, we lost in that case, and then you have to take a decision. But the fact that a lot of people fantasize that Greece is going to win and take over these big institutions, I find it a little bit naive as well. Now, in terms of what you were saying of the institutions in the EU, they're all dominated by neoliberal forces. In the EU Parliament, you have MEPs that the biggest bulk of that is conservative neoliberals. The commissioners are appointed by national governments, which are conservative neoliberals, and the council, which is the head of state, it is by conservative governments across Europe, which are conservative neoliberals. So we haven't done, and this is where I want to focus, is that I don't think we have challenged them on any level, not one the government, national governments. We don't have the movements. We have not we have not yet managed to change the balance of powers within these institutions. And this is why I base it on what I'm saying, that I would work in there. I agree with what you said, that transnational issues, from environment to tax evasion, we cannot stop them if we act in isolation. And I think that's what I would take two things from the Greek case. The first thing is that politics is not about heroes and traitors, and nobody is going to win this fight for somebody else. And we have all a lot of work to do ahead of us, and neoliberalism was very good in working together and solidifying their position for 30 years, while the left is on each other's throat most of the time, fantasizing about that. And the second thing is that we need this unity across nations, create bigger forces, uniting people. This is what I would take from that.
Thank you very much.
Can I make a point?
No, you can't. Actually, we're finished now.
We're finished.
Sorry. But the points that have come up
Just
here...
on the fascism issue.
No.
And that it is the left that it is growing, but I think it's the fastest across Europe.
Okay, many of these issues we can come back to in the next two sessions. So, you know, especially the question about, hang on, you're interrupting the chair for I have to leave at this point. We have, you know, it's about whether we can reform or not reform, about the alliances, what kind of alliances, the questions you raised, we'll come back to them. So they're not been excluded here, they've been brought up. But thanks very much for your contribution.